Welcome to the Made for Agriculture podcast.
Welcome to the Made for Agriculture podcast. I am one of your hosts, Scott Wilburn, staff agronomist with MFA, joined by Landry Jones, Jason Worthington, and Chris Demoss today. And the subject today is a timely one, and unfortunately it's been a timely one for a couple years now, but really taken on even a little more front and center over the last month or two with world events, and that is phosphorus. So we are going to be talking about the agronomics of phosphorus, the future of phosphorus. Chris is going to touch on a lot of those things. Also, anytime you have an event that kind of disrupts things, we start seeing some solutions, some better than others, some more proven than others. I think we're all looking at other ways to address phosphorus on our farms and our growers' farms. And, hopefully some of those things are going to pan out. But we want to make sure that we are grounding recommendations and really the future of of the farms that we're working with good science. So that's what we're going to try to discuss here over the next half hour or so. And Landry, I'll throw it over to you to get started.
Yeah, no, I appreciate y'all letting me come on here today. I'm more the range and pasture side of things, but obviously phosphorus plays a role in those forage production systems, just like they do the row crop side of things, and it probably even maybe more so where I'm at in Southwest Missouri. We've got a lot of low phosphorus test levels in our soils, and that's probably more important than maybe up north. But yeah, like I said, I'll just kind of introduce myself. I'm the range and pasture specialist here for MFA. I know you had mentioned Chris and Jason's names, but let's maybe go around the horn and so they can introduce themselves so folks know what they do here for MFA. So Chris, you're in kind of the top right. I'll let you start it and then Jason finish it up.
Yeah, I'm Chris Demoss. I'm the Senior Vice President of Plant Foods for MFA. So I work with procuring the fertilizer that our company needs and also work with our transportation group. I've been with MFA for 30 years. Most of that time has been on the fertilizer side, the wholesale side of the business, merchandise grain for a couple of years, but mainly commodity trading and purchasing is what I've been involved with most of my career. Jason?
Yeah, Jason Worthington, Senior Director of Agronomic Strategy and Innovation. My main role with MFA is to support our staff so they can in turn support our customers with, agronomic knowledge, but also looking for those next agronomic innovations that might be out on the market. And like a lot of things, phosphorus is a hot topic with those kind of because of this recent climate on that. So.
Okay. Well, appreciate you all joining us today. I know we were kind of talking about it here before we hit play or record on this deal, but there seems like, there's been some movement, obviously, the last couple months in phosphorus prices and other nutrients, but I know phosphorus has been kind of on the rise for a while, it seems like, even going into last fall before some of the stuff in the Middle East and Iran happened. So I guess, Chris, with your expertise, fill people in on maybe how we got to where we're at, or even maybe we need to go back further to discuss where we're at today. And then I know, like Scott, you were mentioning, there might be some future implications here that we need to be aware of and be discussing, so that maybe these innovative type products that Jason and our team look at can be something that we can potentially use in the future for that. So Chris, I'll just kind of turn it over to you. Let folks know kind of where we're at in the marketplace with phosphorus and kind of where it looks like it's headed here in the future.
Yeah, Landry, I think when you look at fertilizers in general, particularly phosphates, you kind of have to, how did we get to where we are? So maybe we'll talk about that period, the history, and then talk about why values are the way they are today. When you look at, say, phosphates or potash, they're minerals that are mined, right? When you look at a potash mine, it's kind of conventional what you think of when you see a mine. There's a shaft, people go down in it, they chip out the ore, they bring it back up to the surface, and they turn it into a uniform product, potash, right? Really, you could just take the potash rock out of the mine and use it that way. but it's not uniform. It doesn't have a consistent analysis. So it's processed a little bit to give it more uniformity. When you look at phosphates, it's mined in a different way. It's usually intermingled in the soil. There's not a vein of it per se. So what will happen is they'll go out, they'll dig down so far, maybe 100 feet, something like that. Some places, depends where you are in the world, maybe you have to go a little bit deeper. Some places maybe not quite as deep. Whereas a potash mine, like the ones in Canada, you're going down 3,200 feet. You're going way down, about as far as you can go down and still keep it climate controlled. You get much further than that, and the pressure from the Earth's surface starts to really heat up. So all that to say is phosphates and potash need that mineral deposit. Nitrogen on the other hand, all that comes out of the air, right? Nitrogen's the most abundant element in the atmosphere. So a little over 100 years ago, some guys figured out a way, a German scientist figured out a way to get nitrogen out of the air and utilize it, right? It's called the Haber-Bosch process. And that's how we get anhydrous, and anhydrous is upgraded to, another liquid form like UAN, or it's turned into urea. It's turned into ammonium sulfate too. But today, let's talk a little bit more about phosphates. So phosphates, there's only so many places in the world where a phosphate deposit exists. It's not in a measurable way in a lot of places. When you look around the globe, Russia has phosphate. North Africa has phosphate deposit. Saudi Arabia has phosphate deposit. North America has some. We have a fairly large phosphate deposit near Tampa, Florida. Most of it's in Florida. That's where most of the phosphate's manufactured in the U.S. And we've been taking that, mining that for probably 50, 55 years now. It's been a while, right? And that field, they stretch out further and further away from the production plants, okay? And as they get into these other phosphate areas, the rock quality is not what it was, 40 years ago. It's diminished. It's just, what it really means is there's not as much rock, density in the soil that they're extracting, and even that's not as high a quality as, say, like a Moroccan mine right now. They got higher grade phosphate. So when they go to manufacture it, it's more efficient. Okay. Now there's a few other places in the U.S. that have some phosphate production, like up in Conda, Idaho, Rock Springs, Wyoming. We have a little bit in White Springs, Florida. But the main production, when we talk about phosphate production in the U.S., is in Tampa. And they call it Bone Valley, right? Because it used to be covered by the ocean, and as that receded, that deposit was left. That's how the phosphates wound up there.
Chris, sorry, I guess just to kind of take that a little bit further. I mean, obviously, anytime that we can either produce our own nutrients or have a friendly neighbor like Canada that has accessible nutrients that we can use, that's going to put us in a good spot, right? Hopefully. And so with those maybe diminishing inventories in the United States, I guess maybe it's a two-part question, and then we can discuss the second part further into our conversation here. But the first part would be, is anybody else looking at opening new mines in the United States? Has there been new technology come on board that they can extract that easier, or are we pretty much what we have is what we have here in the United States?
Well, I think in the U.S., as far as we know right now, what we have is what we have. And then your question made me think of, okay, so those phosphate deposits are in certain geography around the world, but the rest of the world's vying for that mineral, right? It is a global economy. I always say, we've been a global economy since 1492. That's what that was all about. But you take someplace like Brazil, they just don't have phosphate to mine, So Landry, could there be other things done here in the U.S.? There could be some other places. I'm not aware of them right now. And if they do, they're probably more expensive and not as efficient, because the easy low-hanging fruit's already been tapped, right?
And as you mentioned the countries like Brazil, not only do they not have those resources, but they also got soils that are far less forgiving and far less fertile, don't they? I mean, their demand per acre is actually higher than what it is in the U.S. because they just won't grow crop without it.
Yeah, right. And so part of the story that we're talking about today, Brazil's a big part of that story. Landry, I want to come back and say that, yeah, there have been new plants that have been put on, like in Saudi Arabia. People have gone back 30, 40 years ago. I don't know how aware they were of those phosphate possibilities in Saudi Arabia, but they found them. They've been able to develop that infrastructure. Took quite a while. It's pretty hard to put infrastructure over the top of sand. That was one of their biggest limitations, is really just that they were in the desert, and the railroad tracks kept getting covered up with sand, so they couldn't get out to the ports. But Jason, to your point, if you look at the consumption of NPK, total phosphate fertilizers for Brazil, it's double from where it was 10 or 15 years ago. So let's just say, for the discussion point here, they were a 20 million market ton annually, and they're knocking on 50 to 55 million NPK total. And they need to bring in everything: the nitrogen, the phosphates, and the potash. So you think of them as a country that grows a lot of what? Soybeans, right? You guys are the agronomists. They're probably not going to leave a lot of nitrogen for that, but soybeans will. So you see, they've got a pretty large appetite for phosphate potash. And it's been growing at a faster rate than production's been able to keep up with. That's why we've got this global tightness. And that's some of why the story of how did the prices get to where we are. That's part of the story.
Okay. So where do we sit at from, I mean, we kind of talked to how we got to this point, other than maybe the elephant in the room, and that's what's going on over in Iran. So tie that into where we sit current to date as far as markets, availability, things like that.
Hey, and we should point out, excuse me, Chris, I should have said this at the beginning. We're recording this. It is currently 1:22 on March 30th, 2026. So when you start talking about markets and just all the stuff that I think,
1 month old, right, Scott? So
yes. So
Yeah, well,
just
that's a good
wanted to
point.
put that timestamp in there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because market conditions change quickly. I always say the two biggest wild cards in agriculture is weather and the governments, and least predictable is governments, right? Because they make a decision, and it happens overnight, and it can really change the values globally. And partly that's what's going on here with this conflict in Iran. So what a lot of people don't realize, we think of the Middle East as an area that supplies a fair amount of nitrogen to the world, and that's true. About 30 to 35% of the world's urea comes from that Strait of Hormuz. And really, until the last month, maybe even the last 3 weeks, I doubt that most people knew what the Strait of Hormuz was. We did in the fertilizer side because we tracked and bought vessels from that area for a long, long time, out of the Arab Gulf, out of the AG, right? You get Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. That's always been significant. But here's what most people don't realize, and I wasn't really that aware of it until recently: the amount of sulfur that comes out of that region. So just for easy terms, that region produces about 50% of the tradable sulfur for the world. 50%. Why does that matter? Well, one, we need the sulfur in our soils, right? You know that. But the other thing it goes into is manufacturing phosphates. Sulfuric acid is a base ingredient to creating a phosphate. So the other ingredient is you need some anhydrous. So it's not just the rock. You need sulfur and you need nitrogen. Well, now that you've got that constricted, I think we're going to see some challenges down the road because production is going to be stymied. We don't know when that sulfur is going to get out to the rest of the world. Does the U.S. manufacturer in Florida use that particular sulfur in their production? Well, maybe, maybe not, but it's going to change the supply and availability of sulfur in the world. And, generally it's a capitalistic type market when it comes to that type of trade. So what I'm saying is what sulfur is available is going to go to the higher bidder. And we're going to continue to see the input costs go up for phosphates from the anhydrous side and from the sulfur side. Now remember, we're not getting anhydrous moving around in the Middle East either. Did those tons come here? Did it matter to us? Not in a direct way, but it will have an impact on the production of phosphates. Morocco, Tunisia, all those North Africa companies, they need that anhydrous as well as the sulfur that comes out of that region.
Yeah, that's interesting because you don't think about it from that standpoint. I mean, it's easy for me to wrap my head around. Well, the straits closed, we're not as many ships going through, but when you start talking about needing those other products for the other countries to produce their, their phosphate products, then you really start talking about increase in prices. So let me ask you, I guess then, Chris, what we hit on it earlier, is that essentially the United States is lost a lot of their production for phosphates. Is this trend or this increased prices something that you think is going to be around for a while? I mean, even after maybe the Iran thing goes away, is it just the nature of the beast with Brazil in the market so heavily and just lack of product at our fingertips like it used to be? Or do you see, I mean, I know you can't predict the future, but do you see these coming back down to a more reasonable level at some point in 2026 or 2027? Is it just the current condition we're in, or is it something that we should be used to seeing for, quite a while now?
Well, Landry, let me tell you the story of like nitrogen products in the U.S. Okay, just to make my point. If you go back to 2002 or 2003, when I really came in on the buying side for MFA, at that point, natural gas was expensive in the U.S. It was high. It was trading, $14 a unit, right? And in those days, everyone said, look, there's not going to be any more production of nitrogen in the U.S. That's just not going to happen. And then what happened? Fracking. And all of a sudden we had natural gas. That changed everything. So what I'm saying is today, I can only tell you what it looks like today. And there may be some other technology that changes that we're not aware of. There may be a deposit down somewhere that we're not aware of. There's possibly some in Sweden or Finland somewhere in that
Here in
area.
Norway, wasn't it?
Yeah,
It was one way. It was in Scandinavia somewhere. There was a large deposit recently.
Yeah.
But
So that's new, but
the runway to build that facility, that's
as long
not going to be quick.
Exactly right. It's not an overnight process, and it's expensive. Okay. Let's just talk a bit. I know more about urea production and their cost. A new nitrogen plant is going to cost $4 billion. $4 billion to produce maybe 1 million to 2 million on an annual basis. I do the math on that. That's a pretty good debt load per ton. I could talk about in terms of potash. An Australian company has been trying to develop a new potash mine in Canada. They've been working on it for about 8 years now. Still haven't completed. Probably be another year and a half, maybe 2, before they get finished tons to the market. And that project is going to cost them $8 billion. Do the interest cost on that alone on a per ton basis for a 2 million ton plant. I'm just saying I don't see a quick fix, Landry. I think that from what I know today, what we will pay for phosphates now going forward is more than would have been what it has been in the recent past. And I mean that over the course of the last 20 years. You go back to 2002, 2003, phosphates were trading, let's just say 250 NOLA, 250 a ton. Now you're higher, you're at the 6, 7, and as high as 800, 900. I can see that happening again. And the other thing too, just remember domestically, Jason, we were talking a little bit about how Brazil has grown, but the big game changer in the U.S. too was ethanol, the mandate in ethanol. Go back and look at what corn acres were before 2006 and what they were after. Okay. There was a fair expansion into corn. I think in probably 2005 or so, we were planting 88 million. And what did we plant last year, Scott? 94, 95 million acres. A fair amount, right? So it's not just us that's growing. The rest of the world's demand is growing too. And it just takes a long time to get a new site developed if you have the natural resource and base ingredient to do it with. Just because you find the phosphate there, you still got to get the anhydrous to it. You still got to get the sulfur to it. It's not just a real quick fix.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting because, like you said, there's a lot of that information you might be seeing on the news, and there's a lot that people don't know about when you start talking about actually producing phosphates. So,
Well, going back, you mentioned that I've forgotten about the natural gas piece and everything there about 25 years ago, because some at one point contracts were being that I think were deemed for fertilizer production were actually being sold back because the values were so high. Am I misremembering that, Chris? Or 2001, 2, something like that?
Yeah, at that period, it was really tough for nitrogen production, to survive in the U.S. And I saw a piece by someone that was put out was talking about, well, in 1985, there were, let's just say, 47 manufacturers of fertilizer in the U.S. And by 2008, there were only 17. And the reason? They were all going broke. They couldn't make money. Now, Scott, there's been some recent events like several years ago when we had that big freeze down in Texas. You remember when that happened? Some nitrogen companies sold off their gas because it was worth more. Problem was they sold off too much and they couldn't eat their plant. They damaged plants. Hindsight's 2020. But at the time they made the sale, it probably seemed like the right thing to do. So, I'm not trying to paint a negative picture. This is just realistically what looks like going to happen and where we are today. And this is, in broad strokes, kind of how we got here.
Well, I think this is the picture we wanted to paint. I mean, I told y'all before we started recording, I'm actually kind of embarrassed. A couple of weeks ago, I spent probably way too long on a weekend just kind of exploring where domestic sites were for phosphorus, like I was going to be the one to figure it out, but it was on my mind because, we've kind of got nitrogen figured out. We've, as long as everything continues with the supply, we've got good production to the north, and, obviously, we can work with Canada and it's handy and everything else. But when you start moving into phosphorus, and I've been thinking about it for several years. I mean, I went down and visited the mines outside of Tampa there. It's probably been about 10 years ago. And they were talking about 20 years right then, at that point in time when I was there. Now, they were also quick to say, hey, we've been saying that for 20 years, so that it sounded like they, efficiencies and things like that. But a lot of it was those drag lines. I mean, those older equipment. The other thing I remember, just talk about the complications of some of the stuff we don't think about. It's a continuous process. It's 365 days because once they shut it down, massive undertaking to get it fired up again. So there's a lot of those processes in the background we don't even think about. I guess this wasn't the intention, but you painted the picture. I guess that if I wanted to paint one, that's what it was. Is that this is not a quick fix. It's not going to necessarily change tomorrow. When I think when I started, nitrogen and phosphates were 18, 19 cents a unit, and potash bounced between about a dime and 12 cents. And, we left those and, don't see them returning anytime soon. I guess the concern with phosphorus, and Jason and I were visiting about this a little bit the other day, when you start, if you look at this as a short-term event, and if you're not addressing phosphorus on your farms, you're still hauling it away in the crop, and it happens slow and then kind of all at once, as those things do. The other thing, just as I was thinking about it, I've always had my kids with me going out looking at fields, and even at 4 and 5 years old, hey Dad, what's wrong with that field? Is that nitrogen? Hey Dad, is that potassium? They never ask about phosphorus. Because it just doesn't broadcast itself, no pun intended.
So define that, Scott. What do you mean by it doesn't broadcast itself?
Well, I mean, when you Yeah, when you see wheat, when you see corn and it's nitrogen deficient, either because of lack of nitrogen or a water issue or something like that, it's a pale color and everybody knows it's nitrogen deficient. I mean, it's just like your yard or any other grass. With potassium, if you're looking at firing on a corn plant, depending on how it presents itself, it's either nitrogen or potassium. Potassium in beans. I mean, I've had folks that have nothing to do with agriculture ask me about a particular field they saw. Hey, Scott, they know what I do. Scott, what's wrong with the beans at such and such place? It's potassium. It sticks out. Phosphorus doesn't do that. And even when we see the telltale signs of phosphorus, we usually explain it away. Well, it's cool soils, or it's a particular variety, or it flooded, or, there's something like that. But I can tell you, and from 20 plus years prior to doing what I'm doing now, 20 plus years basically spent looking at yield data and looking at soil test data, and they correlate. And I guess to find the numbers exactly, the tipping point, and I'd be interested if you all have a take on this. I've always tried to, I don't want to oversimplify it, but guys have a lot of things going on, and looking at soil tests and memorizing all the pounds per acres and parts per million is the can get in the weeds pretty quick. Phosphates, if you're looking at parts per million or pounds per acre too, we generally report ours in parts per million, just double that to get pounds per acre. So if we're talking 20 parts per million, that's 40 pounds per acre. Why that matters, MU is going to report it in pounds, Midwest Labs is going to report it in parts per million, and other labs are going to do one or the other too. But if you're in single digits in parts per million, you're in the danger zone. If you're up in the 20s or beyond, you're in pretty good shape, and that's where we're going to look at putting back what we take off. And then you can kind of do just think about in between. If you're in the teens, if you're in the mid to upper teens and you're having a good year and a lot of moisture, you might be okay there as well without adding additional. But if you get into a tough year or on tougher soils, even that point's gonna start, needing phosphorus. I went back. I'm familiar with MUs and what we've always used, which are track with that pretty close. Over the weekend, I looked at some of the other states and just to get myself up to speed. And those are still for the most part the numbers that folks are using. And that 20 parts per million, we're adding removal, maybe a little bit of build, and once you get down into the teens, we're adding to get it back up to that optimum level.
Scott, if you don't mind, let's park on that for a little bit, because there is so much in what you said there, and I want to unpack some of that if you don't mind, because I'm going to go back, because I always love listening to Chris. I hate that I have to admit to that here live in front of everybody, but he's here, and I don't want to start a scene right on YouTube.
Well, I was going to say the one thing I've taken away so far, because I've always wondered, the correct pronunciation is Qatar, because that's how Chris Demoss said it. So Cutter is now dead.
Jockeys, man, that's how they all say it. So
all kidding aside, he is one of the most savage guys in the fertilizer industry I know, and he does a fantastic job. I love listening to him talk about the macroeconomics of all this. But Scott, I'm going to go back clear to what you said. You said you got out a map and started looking for phosphate reserves on your own, right? Because I know you're a history buff, you're a geography nerd, you like doing that type of stuff anyway, right? But I think that's what a lot of farmers are doing right now. A lot of our producers are like, I can't control these conflicts that are interrupting the sulfur supply. I can't control Brazil's demand for this. I can't control India or China's demand for food, right? And what that's doing for them to try to be self-sufficient. So what can I control, right? And when things get out of our control, I think sometimes we forget back some of the basics of what you just said about soil tests and things like that. And I'm seeing a couple big things. So I said one of my main roles is to provide agronomic support for our team, right? The questions I'm getting around phosphorus, there's two big ones. First, can I cut my rates on phosphorus this year, and how long will I be okay? Or I'm going to cut my rates on phosphorus so I don't have to cut on potash and nitrogen, right? The second one is, hey, I found this product that's going to work just as good as 80 pounds of phosphorus or 60 pounds of phosphorus, whatever our soil test is going. And we start looking for things that are out of our control, and sometimes we forget the basics and what we know about this management. Are you seeing the same thing out there, Scott?
Yeah, just a lot of questions around, and really it's not new. This is not so much even in the last few weeks. It started probably 2 years ago. Just with different products, and obviously in this, and I think I sounded more negative about that at the beginning than I meant to. We spend a tremendous amount of time looking at new products, looking at biologicals. I mean,
because the macroeconomic outlook that Chris just gave us, we have to look for the alternatives.
And not just on phosphorus. I mean, we're looking at them on biologicals, just all kinds of different products. We've been doing that for several years. It's one of the roles that me and the other agronomists have. I've already placed a lot of trials around the area for this year. So we are looking for those things. I guess it's just to say that we found the major mover to fill in this space in phosphorus. I don't know that we've seen it yet. There are some things. I mean, we've seen positives. Anything that adds to the mycorrhizal, fungi on plant roots, that's a big one. We've seen some things. There's even some things that maybe can increase efficiency in a high pH soil. But as far as 200 bushel corn and you took off 90 pounds of phosphate, as far as removing, I don't know how we put that back out of a jug.
Well, and so
let me. I think that's important that we dive into that. Something that you just said there, compared to your soil test, Scott, that we have to understand it. We have to understand the phosphorus cycle a little bit, right? We have to understand the basics of the phosphorus cycle. So, Scott, you just said an optimum, or what we'd like to, because we don't want to raise the phosphorus level too high, because that's just not good stewardship, right? We'll lose too much in erosion. We'll pollute waterways. We don't want to do that. We want to keep it at where I like to say soils are no longer responsive to phosphorus. It's like maintaining a healthy bank account. You got enough to cover your bills for the next month, right? You got enough phosphorus to cover your crop, and you don't have to add too much to build on that. So you said that's about 20-25 parts per million, right? You equate that to pounds per acre, that's 50 pounds per acre. And you just said 200 bushel corn crop removes 90 pounds of phosphorus, right? So we have to understand when Scott's talking about that, we're talking about the top 6 inches, right? Talking about the top 6 inches of soil. So there's phosphorus below that too. But what we know about our soil test, it's when they are in that range, we're really measuring how responsive the soil is to adding phosphorus. So this is one of the dangers when we cut rates and we get promises of products that you cut your phosphorus rate in half or even leave it out completely and add this product, your yield won't go down. Well, guess what? If your soil test level is 25 parts per million or higher, they're probably absolutely right. And you may not see that yield response for 2-3 years, but all of a sudden you're going to be scraping the bottom of the barrel. And that's when you said it's a little bit, then all at once, right? If you didn't pick up on some terminology, that's exactly what happens.
Well, and we did some of that. I mean, if I say 10 years, it was probably 15 years ago. We played with some products that were supposed to affect the availability of phosphorus. And in hindsight, looking back at who we tried them on, and we noticed that at the time, we had pretty good soil test levels. And on those fields, we could have probably done nothing. Yeah. For a year or maybe even 2 years. I guess the thing, and I don't know if this is the time to get into it, and I beat this to death, so nobody's going to be surprised when I say this. To me, the first thing you have to have in this kind of an environment is a soil test. I mean, we kind of torture the bank account, metaphor, if you will, but it's fitting. I mean, if you're running a business and you've got multiple accounts, you have to know what's in each one, to figure out where you can, maybe not, put something in it for that month or whatever. And we just don't know in a lot of cases. if you have multiple fields, I mean, we need to know where the numbers are on each one, because the recommendation in a time like this, and we did a lot of this over the past year and really probably the last two, basically been given a budget of, hey, this is what I'm going to spend on fertilizer. Well, if we don't have those soil tests, we don't know where we have to put it, and where we can, skip for a year or cut way back or whatever it is. So I guess first and foremost, the soil test is huge. It hasn't changed. The one thing that hasn't changed since phosphorus was about 19 cents a unit, we're charging about the same thing for a grid soil sample as we were then. And I just thought of that. It's one of the few things that hasn't changed, with somewhere, $8, $9, $10 an acre is what it's usually going to take to get you a grid soil test. That value, I'm not suggesting we jump that, but if the value was there back then, I mean, it's definitely there now. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, let me just say, let's talk about it in terms of nitrogen, right? We handle nitrogen management products, right? Like Super U, things that we can mitigate loss with. And the thing is, remember, the higher the priced the nitrogen is, the more return you get on that spend.
That's right.
So it's the same thing that you're talking about here, Scott and Landry. I would say, at the top of this, you said, well, maybe it's not as important or grass. It's extremely important. It's extremely important there. Look, about a third of MFA's fertilizer goes on to hay and pasture. It's a critical component for us, and I think a couple of years ago, Landry, you went around to delegate meetings and talked about pasture management. You remember that? And it struck me at the time, we're still talking about the same stuff that we did when I was in college. And it's still, the fundamentals don't change.
Yeah.
And if you want to talk about another probably good return on a spend, it's probably our precision ag programs, right?
Absolutely.
To me, whether you're row cropping or whether you've got pasture, this is when it pays off the most. And particularly when you look at livestock and the value where cattle are today, why wouldn't you want to get as much production out of that grass as possible? And with the technology we've got now, we could pinpoint that, right? And so there's tools there, kind of, Jason, to what you were saying, that we can implement and that we can control. I can't control how much Bristol is going to use or how much is going to get through the Strait of Hormuz, but we can go out and grid sample that and know where we're at.
We can
Well,
know
the
where
other
our
one,
levels
too.
are at. We can absolutely know where our levels are at. And then we adjust our strategy for what's appropriate, right? Because, the inverse of like a nitrogen stabilizer having greater value right now, because nitrogen fertilizer is also higher, right, than it has been. So yes, you get greater return on your Centuro or your Super U than you would have before, or your Anvil that you put on to stabilize your nitrogen. Here's the problem. The guys say, well, I'm going to cut phosphorus, but I'm going to maintain my potash levels, and maintain my nitrogen levels. I'm going to maintain my herbicide costs, or my fencing for my rotational grazing, whatever it is. You're not going to get as high a return on those things if phosphorus is your most limiting factor. Because Scott said it, 20, 25 parts per million. Landry said it, and he's right. Southwest Missouri, you see the broom sedge across the countryside. What does that typically tell you, Landry?
Yeah.
Two things.
Low pH, low phosphorus.
Yeah, and the low pH is causing a phosphorus issue.
Right.
That's one other thing we talk about. If you want to talk about things you can do, don't just look at your parts per million on your phosphorus. Look at your pH. Make sure that's adjusted, because you're going to get greater availability. But
Lime is a domestic product, by the way.
Yeah,
What's that?
That's right.
Lime is a domestic product, by the way. It's one of the few things that we actually have a halfway supply. Sometimes can be tricky nowadays. That used to be an issue,
But when we look at our soil tests across the state, MU Crop Management Conference, of all the macronutrients, nitrogen and sulfur, we don't really maintain inventories in the soil. But you look at phosphorus and potassium, we hear a lot of guys saying, I'm going to pull back my phosphorus and leave my potassium levels where they're at because it seems much more affordable. That the problem is it's like saying, I'm going to feed one of my children and not the other, right? You can't do that and maintain a happy family, right? You have to feed them both. And in fact, the one that's malnourished is our phosphorus levels. You're about twice as likely in the state to have a low phosphorus level than you are a low potassium level. So pulling that back actually diminishes your return on all your other nutrients if you're in that situation, if you don't know what your soil test is going to tell you. So getting away from a soil test would be one of the worst times. When we're looking to cut costs, that is not where I would do that. Now, I'm a realist, so let's say, if you're in that optimum zone, right, you're in that 20-25 parts per million, one of the worst things you could do is not put on that removal, because Scott said it, you're raising 200 bushel corn, that's about 80-90 pounds of phosphorus coming out. Put back your 80-90 pounds. Because guess what? If this long-term trend continues, you start depleting your soil test levels, it's about an 8-to-1 to get that pound back. It's about a 1-to-1 to replace removal. In simple terms, there's more complexity to it than that. But really, it's about 1-to-1 to replace removal. To replace depletion,
Jason,
it's about
sorry,
8-to-1.
extend on that a little bit further. What do you mean by like 8-to-1 versus 1-to-1? I guess expand on that.
Well, Scott, you're the one to talk to me about that. So that soil test, if it goes down part per million, right? That's 2 pounds per acre. It's going to take 16 pounds to replace that too. Sometimes higher.
Sometimes it's as high as 17 pounds to build a pound, or be 34 in parts per million language. Potash is much more forgiving. It's more of a 3-to-1 pounds per acre, or 6-to-1 if you're in parts per million. But yeah, once phosphorus is down, and listen, I can't tell you how many phosphorus tests I've seen over the years that are in low single digits, 1s and 2s and 3s and 4s. I mean, once they're that low, I mean, you're talking a tremendous amount of product to start moving something back.
So that's the other end of it. Like, we don't want to draw down during this period of time. It's one of the worst things to do. It's penny wise, pound foolish, right? To do that right now. The other thing I'd say, I'm not going to be the one that looks at somebody in the current economic environment and says, okay, you are at a 5 part per million Bray 1 phosphorus. So when I say Bray 1 phosphorus in your soil test, that's the available phosphorus. There's multiple ways to measure phosphorus, but we're looking at the highly available pool, right, of our organic phosphorus. I'm not necessarily going to tell a guy, yes, let's start building your soils at that 8-to-1 to 17-to-1, whatever it is, in this year, right? So what can a guy do in this situation? Well, I think there are some options. I would be putting on at least removal still, but you may supplement that with banding, for example. If you could do something in proximity to the root zone, create a high concentration of available phosphorus, you may be able to mitigate some of that yield loss, right? But it's not going to be a solution in other soils. Eventually, you want to get back on that build pad, in my opinion. Other things we can look at. And Scott and I talked about this. We can be accused of being greedy fertilizer salesmen. That's just Chris, right? But I'm not going to depending on what animal manures are right now, if you have access to that, that is a domestic source of phosphorus. It can be incorporated in. And what I don't like about them is the variation. So you got to make sure you're testing your manure, and you can't vary your nutrients independently. So I usually like to use the manure as one of the baselines, variable rate that other. So maybe you get a flat rate of phosphorus and you can variable rate your potash, or vice versa, because you're going to get that same ratio across the field. Those are some things we can do as well. But
and the big one on that, I mean, I was even thinking of, and just looking at different tests over the years, and I get it. I've I've spread manure. I understand you make a lot of passes and you're driving more than you're spreading, and I get it. I get why it all goes where it's handy. But if spending a little money upgrading, maybe even some equipment that allows you to find some farther, parts of the farm and literally spread that out a little more. Um, if this is something that continues to be a longer trend, we just really need to use that product that we have and not just use it as a waste. Because there are some places that are getting really hot while right beside them we're still spreading fertilizer. So let's spread it out a little bit. The lime thing's huge too. I know you touched on that a little bit, Jason, but if we can get our pH, particularly on lower pHs, on higher pHs, we get into some other things that tie up phosphates, but in lower pHs, things that we don't even think about, aluminum, some other elements, start creating some complexes with phosphate. If we can kind of stay in that sweet spot of 6.5, we always think of that in terms of legumes and think, well, corn, it's not as big a deal, and it's not, but it is a big deal for the phosphorus availability. So adjusting that, I mean, you want to talk about low hanging fruit, and lime's not as cheap as it used to be. I mean, it's really jumped, but again, you get that soil sample, you figure out where you need it. That's a huge thing of just being as efficient as possible.
Yep. Well, you're exactly right. The pH and the metals cause a lot of the tie up. And I think that's another thing that's always important to understand on the phosphorus cycle is sometimes those high pHs are actually worse on availability than low pHs for phosphorus too. So some of these methods, even you may have a phosphorus level through the roof, but if your pH is 7, 8 in a river bottom or something like that, you may want to look at some of those banding opportunities, proximity to the seed, help things out. I guess, Scott, the other thing, other than just the cut rates, again, to me, the soil sampling should be your guide in good times and in bad on rates. But when the other thing that's really happening a lot, and it's kind of coincided not just with these phosphorus prices, but with the rise in interest of biologicals, is what things we can do. I'll tell you, we're testing a lot of things on that, but the most reputable ones that we've seen so far, more than likely, it's going to be incremental change, right? It's not going to be something that revolutionizes how we fertilize phosphorus on that. So I think it's important to understand we got several pools of phosphorus in the soil. Potash is really kind of one big pool. It's all kind of the same in the soil, right? How it's taken up. Nitrogen, there's different things in there, but it doesn't stick around. So we just manage it every year. When we think of phosphorus, there's a couple big important things. We have our organic phosphorus. That's our decaying plant and animal matter, right? Then we have our inorganic. Well, it's moving back and forth between those pools. But then to make it even more complicated, you look at the inorganic, the mineral part. You have active and you have inactive. And when we really see is there's degrees of inactivity. There's multiple different pools in there. So what these biologicals are really looking at is one of two things. Scott mentioned like fungal extensions of the roots. Those things naturally occur in the soils. We can inoculate from them and they help. That's just increasing the surface area of your roots. But there's other things that move phosphorus either from that organic to the available or the inactive to the active. Guys, we're talking about pounds per acre, not dozens of pounds per acre or hundreds of pounds per acre when we're talking about these things. We're talking single-digit pounds that these things are more likely to provide us. And what they're going to do is help gaps of that hidden hunger that Scott talked about. Little bitty corn plants are often very hungry for phosphorus because they have little bitty root systems, but they outgrow it. Well, what if we feed it during that period? Is it going to help? These biologicals, I believe eventually we're going to find some of them that are really going to help us. They're going to help about this much and get us to that next few bushel. It's not going to be a cure-all replacement for phosphorus fertilizer anytime soon. If I'm proven wrong, I'll be happy. And Chris will focus on nitrogen and potash, and we will figure out how we can partner with our growers to provide that solution for them. But we just don't see that happening. We got to maintain those soil test levels. Does that make sense, Scott? Or are those some of the things you're seeing too?
No, I think so. I think, well, even with a lot of these products that we're seeing, I mean, not just picking on phosphate, but, nitrogen products, even some of the others, they're not necessarily full-blown replacements. They're a small piece of it. And so even if we thought that we were going to be able to take 10%, off the table, which from what we've seen so far would be a big number, I would think. We're still left with a pretty good delta of what we need and what we're putting back. So I guess, I don't want to oversimplify things. For me, the take home for this is not the number's going to go higher, it's going to go lower, but as far as the foreseeable future, higher prices than what we've historically been used to are here. $2 seemed pretty cheap for gas when I was a kid, it was 80, 90 cents. We've hit some kind of plateau, I think, with phosphorus where, we're going to be dealing with higher numbers. Unfortunately, at times they're going to be really higher numbers. And to think that it's all going to come back and I'll catch up in a couple of years, that's scary to me. And it's concerning to me because I know the kind of hole that you can get yourself in really fast. And then you're left, well, you got to dig out of it. And maybe the financial situation's the same at the time, as far as at least the price. Hopefully the income side is better. But I think we're just looking at small, shorter, the demand situation, the global, everything Chris talked about, that's not going to get wrapped up in the next few months. So soil test, that's the big one. Get your lime in order. If you're fortunate to have animals on the place and you can move that stuff around, take care of that. And then when we get to actually having to apply product, let us go back to those soil tests and make sure that we're putting it where it absolutely needs to go. And
at that point, we're
absolutely. And even to the next level. I mean, we've went through some of these periods, not so much on the high commodity side, a little bit of that too. But just looking at the economics of it, and I'd have first of all, I usually had soil tests and when I was sitting down with the guys I was working with. But the next thing is okay, you're looking at how long you have ground. Is this ground year to year? This one's got a 5-year contract. This is our ground. I mean, we try to kind of throw all that stuff into it because that's what I'd want to do if it was mine, and that's how I want to treat it.
Well, Scott, you mentioned that there's more and more landowners and even other organizations that are taking inventory on those nutrients. As that changes hands, they will measure it before and after a sale and try to quantify it in the sale. And
yep.
I think there's going to be a lot of, it's probably a future podcast edition, honestly, is like, what are the implications of that inventory? Should we be looking at that separate from the land that we're purchasing? Because you're buying space when you're buying land to do work on. Those nutrients can be measured independently, and a lot of people are doing that, and there's markets for that developing out there. Make sure you're measuring that before and after that land changes hands. So even then, I get what you're saying. We've had this philosophy, well, treat rented ground like a rented mule. In some cases, some folks have. I'm not saying everybody, but I think that's going to be less and less as guys continue to monitor phosphorus levels, other nutrient levels in the soil.
Well, I guess where I was going with that was, I understand you may not have this in 2 years. We want to do all we can to make sure that it's not limiting for the current crop, but also knowing that you only have so many fertilizer dollars to spend, and
that's the reality too, for sure.
Yeah. So it was that. Yeah. But the real big one just to push is you won't see this. Not like with other nutrients. And, we do, I mean, when we're establishing a new crop, I mean, it's a big deal. But again, talking down Landry and David Moore, and I've talked a lot about this in the past. When you're trying to establish a pasture, you're trying to establish grass, or this becomes an issue in And wheat, low phosphate can definitely play into that, and you can see that. And in those cases, you can see it to the line sometimes. But once we have an established crop, a lot of times it truly is a hidden hunger that once it's at a level that you really notice, it's going to take a lot to build it back. So I don't want to pull the plug on this prematurely, but is there anything else we need to cover, guys? Or
Well, I think the one thing kind of we talked around it a little bit. And I know it's counterintuitive, but from a economic sense, sometimes you have to spend more to lose less. It feels so counterintuitive, but you've got to play the long game, right? And that's challenging. That's challenging. But if you're going to survive, you have to do that sometimes. So just keep that in mind.
well, we're already kind of in season now, and it's not too late in some instances to get some soil tests pulled. But if it's not part of your program between now and fall, make it part of your program.
Well,
And it may be as simple as cleaning up lime. That's a huge one.
This phosphate issue is not going to change dramatically between now and next fall. Yeah, I mean, we're going to be faced with these same kind of questions, the quandaries, I think, with phosphates into the next spring for sure.
And there's going to be continued innovations that will change how we manage it too. So we're going to continue getting those questions on that front too, right? Is like, can I do this instead of this? A lot of times it's going to be, guys, we can do this in addition to this and get the return. But I'm going to beat that dead horse one more time, Scott. Get your soil test, know where you're at. Then you can go right rate, right product, right source, right time. It's 4 hours after you get the knowledge that you need on that soil test.
And we're trialing a ton of products. I mean, if we find one, we're going to be the first to tell you about it.
We're here in March. It's March Madness is going on. So a great sports analogy is this: always go back to the fundamental. It doesn't matter if you're playing basketball or if you're growing crops. The fundamentals are not going to change.
All right. And those pastures, hay ground, all of that's a good place to stab some ground too and see what your numbers are.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure. I'd say for sure, because there's money on the table there where livestock values are, right?
Yeah. Yep. There's a handful of people reinvesting back into their soil nutrients with the high dollar calves, but there's a lot that aren't either. I've heard kind of the same thing down this way, that people are going to back off on their phosphorus inputs this year, because mainly they had good yields last year, right? They've got hay stacked in the barn, and they forget that they pulled a lot of nutrients off that field last year.
Yeah, we have short memory.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, there's a built-in reminder when you're driving down the highway and you see the field full of burn sedge, and I already noticed one that I hadn't noticed in the past this morning when I was out looking at wheat. Think of pH and think of phosphorus. And then think of your soil test.
Burn sedge is the one that always get the headlines on that too, but it's just going to reduce tillering. It's going to thin out pasture. Your range and pasture chemical bill, that might make Landry smile, but that might go up, but really, we want that fertilizer to grow that grass, choke those weeds out, produce more beef for that producer. And if you're going to establish a new crop, don't start off in a bad spot.
Right.
The other thing too is when you're talking about pasture, what's going to survive better in drouthier conditions? And we're kind of set up, we're already droughty now. So if your grass is healthier, got a better roots, it's probably got better chances to yield more and come back quicker.
Right.
So just something to keep in mind.
Good points. All right, gentlemen. Well, if everybody's done, we'll wrap this one up. I appreciate everyone joining us today. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Thanks, Landry.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you all.
Thank you for listening to Made for Agriculture, brought to you by MFA, your whole farm solution.